I'm called Pastor Pat in the neighborhood, and I like that, when I'm walking down the street and people know me as that. But there's a chief shepherd, and his name is Jesus. And we're all in needing of his shepherding and his guiding. The Lord is our pastor. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pasture. He leads me beside still water. He restores my soul. That's our pastor. That's our shepherd. And let's never forget that. Because I feel so unworthy just to be responsible to shepherd this beautiful flock of people. This week, I had an assignment. I work in the public schools, and I was given 2 blocks of wood. And the shop teacher said, take John over here and make a pen out of these 2 blocks of wood. And my mind starts thinking spiritual things all the time. I used to work in a lab in Ireland, and we had a cylinder where we would take water and wash things through, and it was called regenerating the water, and you washed it. And I remember thinking of that verse, washed in the regeneration of the Spirit and washing of the water of regeneration. I can't even quote the verse now. It was right on the top of my head, but my mind's kind of falling apart here. But anyway, when I was given those 2 blocks of wood, I started thinking about creation and how we've talked about creation when we're going through Genesis here. And then I started thinking about how the shop teacher gave me a template, a pattern to follow and to shape what I was going to make. And I thought about how Jesus is our template. He is our pattern. We're to watch and to follow his life. And then as we took the block of wood and we began to screw it down and to tighten it, he gave me a sharp prod that was to start to take all the rough edges off of that block of wood. And I started to think about all the trials that God puts us through to take all the rough edges off of us. And I brought in my finished product today. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it looks pretty darn sharp, doesn't it? And I gave that to my wife, and she was really impressed because she knows I can't make anything with my hands. And she said, wow, Patrick, that's nice. You keep that. And I said, no, I want you to have it. But when she insisted, I went ahead and took it. But, I started thinking of some other things that, that pen was only useful after a long process. I sat there for an hour on that lathe as it spun and as it chipped the wood away. And I was tempted to rush the process. I'm an impatient guy. And I'd stick that prod in a little bit too hard and the thing would start to smoke. And he'd come over, he says, no, don't do that. You're going to scar the wood. I started thinking about God. God never pushes too hard. He knows how much we can take. He doesn't want to scar us. He doesn't want to leave any bruises that are too deep that we're going to not heal from. And then he said to me, he says, you've got to do it gently and you've got to go back and forth and let the template tell you when those grooves are going to go in. And I thought about God too. Sometimes he just gives us a resting period. Sometimes things are all calm for a while and then boom, the dip comes in and then they get calm and then the dip goes down again. And then I started thinking about, we're in Genesis again, Genesis 40, and I'm thinking of Joseph. And Joseph's life, man, what the dips he went through. And then they seemed like they were going good. And then he'd hit another dip and God would stick that little prod in and it would push away and chip away in Joseph's life. So I thought, that'll be a neat little illustration. And I got to give God all the credit because, I'm not very creative. And I was telling Caleb last night, I said, I don't have any clarity on what I'm going to teach. And Caleb said, I'll pray for you. And I started praying, and I'd start praying, and a thought would come to me, and I'd stop praying, and I'd write it down. And I'd say, oh, God, I was praying. And then I would stop praying again, and God would give me another thought. And so, the Lord, He does it all so that He gets all the glory. And I started thinking about all the people that God used in the Bible. And there were people like us, Brandon. Nobody fancy. Nobody sharp. Nobody with a high, mighty background and a big bank account. God delights in using the rough blocks of wood and putting them on the lathe and turning them into something that's beautiful so that God gets all the glory. And I thought of 3 examples in the Old Testament, and I know that most of us don't know the Old Testament yet, and that's why we're going through it so that we'll understand it. But there was a period in the Old Testament when God had judges over Israel. They had come out of Egypt, and then they had a period of time where they went into the land, and God put judges over them. And one of the judges' names was Gideon, and Gideon was from a little tiny tribe called Manasseh. And Gideon was afraid of the enemy, so he was down in a hole, hiding so he could get his bag of food together. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "You mighty man of valor." That's the way God looks at us, and we don't see ourselves that way. I see myself as that big, chunky block of wood, and God sees something else. And God saw something else in Gideon. He called him a mighty man of valor. And he said, and Gideon turned around, he says, I'm the runt of my family, basically, and I'm in the least tribe of all of Israel. How am I going to deliver the Midianites? How am I going to rescue our people? Well, you go a little bit further in the Old Testament, and the judges were done. The people said, we don't want to judge anymore. We reject, and God was really their king, and they said, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. So God gave them a king, and he was like all the other kings. He was this big, strong dude named Saul, and man, he could just, he impressed everybody by his height and his stature. But he wasn't the kind of king that God wanted, and so he chose a little shepherd boy who was out with the flocks and told Samuel, go anoint a new king. And he saw David's firstborn son, Eliab, a big, strong kid, and he said, surely this is the Lord's anointed. What did he say, David? He said, don't look on the outward appearance, because how does God see, David? He looks on the heart. God has refused him. For he doesn't see as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. You know, if you drove up and down this street, you wouldn't think this would be a place to plant a church. But God's looking on the hearts of these neighbors and the people around here. And he says, this is where I want to start a church. Amen. Amen. And you're a step ahead of me. You usually are, David. For you see your calling, brethren. Not many wise after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble or called, but God has chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. God has used the things that are despised. Yea, God has chosen the things that are not, to bring to naught the things that are, and this is why that no flesh should glory in his presence. Well, after the kings went astray and they stopped following God, so God sent a prophet to stir up the hearts of the king, to bring them back to God, and he chose a man named Jeremiah, and Jeremiah said, God, you can't use me. I'm just a youth. I'm inexperienced. And God told Jeremiah, don't say that you're a youth, that you're inexperienced, for you'll go where I send you, and you'll say what I tell you, and I will put my words in your mouth. Be not afraid of their faces. I will be with you. I want to share with you today just a couple of things I've learned out of chapter 40 of Genesis. I've entitled the teaching today, I was going to call it When Life Seems Unfair. You know, sometimes life seems like it is unfair, but the reality is life is unfair. That's the truth of it. Life is unfair. Sometimes it seems like it's unfair, but we live in a fallen world. We live with sin. We live in corruption, and we live in an age and time where things aren't fair. We don't get a fair shake. Sometimes you don't get the promotion that you deserved. Sometimes you don't get the recognition. Sometimes you've worked for something and it all falls apart. Sometimes people betray you. People give you promises and they don't keep them. Life is unfair. But how do we act when life is unfair? Well, Joseph is a template. Joseph is a pattern that you and I can learn from. Joseph was in his house, and he was the favored son, and his dad gave him that coat of many colors that we read about and talked about. And his brothers threw him in a pit and stripped him of his coat. That wasn't fair. Joseph had done nothing. In fact, Joseph was a godly man. He'd brought an evil report on his brothers and said, "This is what they're doing, Dad, and I'm going to be a trustworthy son to you." He had done nothing to deserve that, and he found himself in a pit. Found himself then sold as a slave to the Ishmaelites, to the Midianites. And here he is as a slave. He did nothing to deserve being enslaved in Potiphar's house. In fact, he was the best slave he could have possibly been. He did everything that his master asked him to do. He was so trustworthy that his master didn't even know the food that was in the house. He entrusted everything to him. And his wife accused him of rape. How unfair is that? So he gets sent to prison. That's pretty unfair, isn't it? He finds himself in prison. There's a couple of prisoners that are there alongside of him. He interprets their dreams and he says, "Don't forget me when you get out." You know what they did? They forgot him. They left him there to rot. Well, how unfair is that? That's pretty unfair, isn't it? And how do you and I, how should we react when we feel like life is unfair to us? First thing that we need to remember, as Joseph experienced in his life, that God is with us. Everywhere Joseph went, we find these words, but God was with him. You know what's important about that? If you don't realize and understand that God is with you, it is so easy to get a chip on your shoulder. It's easy to get into this feeling as, woe is me. Let's have a pity party, and I'm going to invite everybody to feel sorry for me. You know what happens when you start having a pity party? You stop seeing other people's needs around you. And you stop seeing the opportunities that God brings into your life, because your eyes are only on yourself and they're not on others. Joseph was in Potiphar's house, and he saw ways that he could serve him and be a help to Potiphar. And you know who got all the glory for that? It wasn't Joseph. It was God. Because Potiphar saw that God was with Joseph, and Potiphar figured out, hey, if I entrust these things to Joseph, then God's going to bless it. You know why? We have a God that is faithful to His promises. When life seems unfair, God is with you and God will keep His promises. God made a promise to Joseph's great-great-granddad, Abraham. He said, I will bless those who bless you. And God kept His promise. God blessed Potiphar because he was blessing Joseph. And so God used him. So he finds himself in prison. He did nothing wrong to get there. Accused of rape. Accused of all kinds of things. But you know what? God was in all those things. And because Joseph didn't feel sorry for himself, he saw what God was doing. Because you know what? Things could have been a lot worse. They could have been a lot worse. When you see what's going on in your life, you can always look around and you can say, you know what? It could have been a lot worse than it is. I can complain about a leaky faucet in my house, but you know what? It can be a lot worse than a leaky faucet. I can complain about receding gums, but you know what? It gets a lot worse than receding gums, folks. We ought to be thankful for what we do have. This is what I'm getting at. Joseph, when he got down there to Egypt, you know who they sold him to? They sold him to Potiphar, a chief official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. He could have been sold to anybody. He could have been sold to the dog catcher. He could have been sold to the guy who went out and scooped up the camel dung. But no, he was sold to a guy who was a high official. And then we got accused of rape. You know what could have happened to Joseph? He could have got killed. I was reading this book about the customs of Egypt at that time. A slave was just like a piece of property. And I was telling Chris this last week. He could have got lashed 1,000 times. In other words, you could kill the dude. But instead, he was put in prison. God gave him grace. God gave him favor. So when you think life is unfair, God is with you, and look how bad it could have been, and realize that God is putting other things into your life and granting favor where you're at. I remember applying for a job, and boy, I really wanted this job. I thought this job was suited exactly. I mean, it had my name all over it. It was to be a chaplain and a track coach. I've been to seminary and I've been to the Olympic trials. Who else is qualified for that but me? It should be my job. It was outside of Washington, D.C. And I remember Tracy and I went up to Orange County, Virginia, and we were thinking, wow, look what God is going to do. And then I put in my resume and put in all my qualifications as a runner and my Master of Divinity, thinking, wow, I'm going to get in there. I got the letter back, and God shut that door. And I remember going for a run thinking, God, thank you, because you've got something else for me. And God sent Tracy and I to Ireland for 10 years. And I'd much rather been working with a bunch of micks than working with a bunch of mucky mucks up in Washington, D.C. I wouldn't have fit it. I probably got canned my first year anyway. Mick is a kind of a kind name for Irish folks, if you didn't know. But anyway, God gives you favor even in the midst of those things that seem unfair. You know, God was teaching Joseph about his faithfulness. God was receiving all the glory when he was there in prison. Joseph was seeing the needs of those men. He saw opportunities to help. He did what he needed to do where he was at. And that was the biggest lesson that I learned for me this week. That God has got things for me to do right downtown Ogden and bloom where God plants me. He was planted in Potiphar's house, and man, he bloomed. He was stuck in prison, and boy, he bloomed. And other people were the beneficiaries. Other people received the blessings and the benefit because Joseph didn't react feeling sorry for himself when life was unfair. Got just a couple of applications now for us. We've already been talking about really application this whole time. Joseph was not only a slave, but he was imprisoned as a slave. Yet he was faithful to serve others. Two applications here. Opportunities come in our lives as a result of being faithful. God will entrust more opportunities to you when you take little things in your life and you are faithful with them. God's not going to give you more responsibility until you learn to be faithful with little things. Be faithful to the church. Be faithful to worship. Be faithful to give your offerings to support the ministry of the church, and God will entrust other things to your life. God may have a position in this church like this little pin, and right now you're just a chunky block of wood, but be faithful with it, and one day God's going to give you a ministry and a service in this church. Second application, we need to view what may seem like a setback as really an opportunity to be used by God. Even while in prison, Joseph shows concern for others and he cares for them. He noticed that they were sad. When he went in that morning, his job was to serve all the other prisoners, and he noticed that their countenance was sad. He wasn't looking inwardly, he was looking outwardly. Application. When we're filled with self-pity and preoccupied, we fail to recognize the needs of other people. Second application from this, we must take our perception of other people's needs one step further and put it into action. You know, it's one thing for me to go up and down this street and see, you know what, so-and-so's got a need. And Shelley, you're good about this. You take it a step further. You see somebody's got a need, you know what she does? She takes them a bowl of soup. She does, I know it. Somebody needs a loaf of bread, you know what she does? She goes home and she bakes a loaf of bread and she takes it to them. And that's what Joseph did. He saw some needs and he said, what's the problem? How can I help? I'm good about seeing needs and then just walking away from them. Joseph took it a step further. Genuine faith acts upon what we believe in God's character. If we believe God's able to do something, we do something about it. Caleb prayed that today. Joseph said, tell me the dream. Aren't interpretations from God? You tell it to me now. He knew Joseph knew that God could tell him the interpretation. He says, you tell it to me because my God is able. He acted on what he knew God was able to do. That's an application. Third area that I saw in this chapter, God is sovereign. On the third day, he said, you're going to get out of here. You see that dream, there was 3 grapes, bunches of grapes, and he squeezed the grapes, and there was 3 loaves of bread, and he said, those are 3 days, and in 3 days you're going to get out of this prison. Well, Pharaoh's birthday was 3 days later. I was also reading in this little book about history and the culture of Egypt. It was a custom in Egypt at that time, when your birthday comes, when you were Pharaoh, you would release one prisoner. Joseph didn't know it was going to be 3 days. God did. God is sovereign. He's in control of everything. On the third day, one was restored and the other one was hung. God's sovereign, but that's not an excuse for inactivity. Just say, well, God's in control. I'm not going to do anything. No, God's in control, but I'm going to do everything I can. You're going to get out of here in 3 days, Joseph said, but don't forget about me. Joseph's already thinking, I've got a plan. I'm going to use this for my benefit. God is sovereign. God is going to build his church in Ogden. He promised us that. But that's not an excuse for inactivity. That's all the reason for action. That's why I can go out confidently and knock on doors. That's why, Shelley, you can invite people to church and God's going to do a work in their heart. That's why when people come to the Bible study, God's going to stir in their hearts and say, God is among you people. God is sovereign. And that's not an excuse for inactivity. That's motivation for moving forward. We need to do all that we can to accomplish our goals, yet trust in God's perfect timing. I'm sure Joseph thought, this is my ticket out of here. 3 days from now, he's going back to Pharaoh, and I am out of this prison. No. Come back next week, and you'll find out when he gets out. Oh, man. Let's just pause in prayer. And remember these things when you feel like life is unfair. Lord, I just thank you, God.